They have become an institution in themselves, and they are popular and beloved by locals and tourists alike. Not just for the food and drink they have, which is great, by the way, but more so for their vibe, their presence, their attitude, and it's an attitude of gratitude. My dog Pancake has developed an interesting habit over the last, say, I don't know, 6 months or so. She's 11 now, and as she's just starting to get older for a dog, she has developing a couple of new habits we've noticed. One of them is she wakes up in the morning whenever one of us gets up, trots on downstairs, maybe has something to eat, follows us around getting coffee, and then sits down on her little dog bed and takes a nap. And this is so in keeping with her nature, however, though, because like all dogs, she loves to take a walk. And we frequently walk in a big public park near our house. And when she's done walking, she will find a spot under a tree that has a picnic table, because there are a bunch of picnic tables in the park. And she'll just sit there. And you cannot drag her away. This is 50 pounds. It feels like 500 if you're trying to get her to move, and she does not want to go anywhere. But her habit of doing this, of just sitting in the morning and just sitting in the park under her picnic table, looking out, enjoying everything, has really reinforced in me the attitude of gratitude for just being that obviously comes to her a lot more naturally than it does to me. She doesn't have any of those dog things getting, or human things getting in the way of her dog enjoyment of the world around her and just being thankful for it. It's the attitude of gratitude. And while I was in Portugal this summer, we spent some time in Kiosk, and I kept thinking how much my dog, Pancake, would have loved hanging out in the kiosks. And these are the kiosks. The kiosks are like a combination of snack bar, cafe, coffee shop, backyard patio, and pub. An old photomat booth surrounded by shaded tables and chairs. But unlike the old photomats you could see in the pictures, they have an aesthetic charm. Each uniquely decorated individual Art Nouveau masterpiece. Pastel colors, wrought iron, Moorish points and curves, angles, azulejos, those Portuguese tiles. They're not fast food stands, although they sell food. You know, they're not the food cart you find on the street corner in New York City, although they do have food and drink. They're an oasis of slow food, an oasis of slow drink, conveniently placed where you need them. They have become an institution in themselves, and they are popular and beloved by locals and tourists alike. Not just for the food and drink they have, which is great, by the way, but more so for their vibe, their presence, their attitude, and it's an attitude of gratitude. They're a reminder to stop, sit, breathe, look around, find some things, feel your senses. What can you touch? The kiosks just invite you to do this. Smell the roses. The kiosks are for people definitely who do not live to work, but work in order to live. And you see a lot of people coming from work hanging out at them on their way home or at lunchtime. You know it's spring in Portugal when the kiosks open. These kiosks first appeared in Lisbon and then in other places in the late 19th and early 20th century, inspired by similar places in Paris and Vienna coffee houses, and the Art Nouveau movement in architecture and decor. And they very quickly became very popular among the people. They became spots for congregating, conversing, hanging out. They sold newspapers and lottery tickets and cigarettes and food and snacks. And then the Estado Novo, the fascist regime, took over Portugal in the 1920s. And they discouraged the kiosks because they were public places where people gathered and talked and shared information. And any authoritarian regime doesn't want people talking to each other and maybe sharing accurate information about things with each other, or, God forbid, ideas that the state doesn't agree with. So the Estado Novo slowly but surely kind of clamped them down, and the huts fell into neglect and disrepair. And when the dictatorship ended in the mid-1970s and Portugal joined what would eventually become the European Union, that time that European Economic Community, Portugal was for the first time kind of invaded by that corporate international brand name culture. McDonald's showed up for the first time. And as the country slowly modernized after the fall of the dictatorship, things came along with that modernization. Things got a little dirty. Crime went up a little bit. Urban areas became in need of renewal. Some of the culture was being lost, including the siesta culture that is part of Portuguese and Spanish and Italian and other places where you need a midday break from the heat to eat, maybe take a nap. And that was starting to go away. So in Lisbon, a city councilor, Jose Fernandes, asked for proposals to open the kiosks again. And a journalist, Catarina Portas, became an entrepreneur and found an architect, João Regal, and they worked to restore and open the kiosks. And the first 3 opened in 2009, and they were an overnight sensation. A big hit. Their restoration and reopening soon became part of a plan in Lisbon called the Kiosk Strategy. And it involved not just the kiosk, but restoring the public gardens, creating and cleaning green spaces, expanding bicycle paths, making a place livable in a way that it hadn't been in decades. Against the rising tide of globalization and fast food and international branding and corporate chains, the revival of the kiosk provided a real alternative, an alternative that was based in local history, local culture, and local custom. You can certainly get wine and ice cream and sodas and lemonade and pizza at most of the kiosks, but they also started offering the old traditional foods that were served at the original kiosks and brought them back. Ginginha. It's a little tiny cup of cherry liqueur with a sour cherry in it. If you hit the right kiosk, you get it served in a chocolate cup that you can then eat afterwards. These kiosks know what they're doing. Limonada. Grosella, made from red currants in syrup. Café Mazagran, coffee and lemonade. Never would have put those two together. It's really good. Maidenhair leaves and orange blossom tea. Almond horchata, all kinds of things. Not to mention the usual bolas and pastel de natas and pastries and everything else. These places are amazing. And every time I was at one, I thought of Pancake sitting under her picnic table. I'm like, this is it. This is the picnic table in the park. They're everywhere here. I was in Portugal 17 days, and all but 3 of those days included a stop and a sit for a while at a kiosk because they're the greatest things ever. My favorites were the day we sat at the kiosk in the Praça Rosario, a huge plaza in Lisbon, dozens and dozens and dozens of tables around the kiosk. And we had limonadas and read our books in the shade. And we laughed with the small children, the family at the table next to us. And when we'd go up and refresh our limonada, we brought one and a pastry for the homeless person who was sitting at the table next to us. Because everybody was included. It was fascinating and inspiring. There was a kiosk in a tiny praça in the Príncipe Real neighborhood where on the night of the St. Anthony Festival, and if you bid on the St. Anthony Festival last night, you will experience this, we tried our first ginginha, the cherry liqueur. And we were included in a toast that another group of people at the table next to us was having. They just pulled us over. They didn't know who we were. They didn't know we were tourists, didn't know anything. They just pulled us over and we got wrapped into the toast and then we got wrapped into dancing. This is the kind of culture we got to have more of. This is really important. Perhaps my favorite kiosk was the one we went to in Évora, Portugal, where we sat and had a nice cold vinho verde after a day of sightseeing 20 yards from the ruins of a Roman temple, surrounded by other sightseers and people from town getting out of work nearby and coming by and sitting down, having a cold drink or a snack before they went home. Sitting in the kiosks and having coffee and wine and snacks, I noticed how like the coffee and wine culture there was very different from ours. In Portugal, people drink coffee around the clock. Not a big deal. And they do this because there, a cafe, is what we would call an espresso. So it's a lot easier to have lots of these during the day than the 16-ounce mug we put coffee in during the day. You can't do that all day. And in our culture, coffee is used a lot for stimulant, so we can be more alert, get more done, have more energy. But I noticed sitting in the kiosk something really interesting about coffee in Portugal, that it was not for energy, it was for stopping and talking. The coffee was almost a prop to say, hey, let's sit and chat. Let's linger. Let's be grateful for just being able to be here right now with each other. And it happened all the time, every time we stopped at one. This was going on all day long at these. Same thing for a glass of wine. I noticed sitting in the kiosks that people would have a glass of wine round the clock too. Maybe not in the morning, but anytime from midday on, you see somebody having a wine at the kiosk. But it wasn't for drinking like we might in our culture. It was for stopping and talking to somebody. And if you weren't sitting with somebody, talking to the people at the table next to you. It was like coffee hour that included everyone outside in the sunshine. It was really inviting. You know, we don't really have this in our culture. It's pub-like. You know, we have lots of bars in our culture where you can sit and have a drink and watch sports on TV in a loud atmosphere. We don't tend to have lots of pubs in our culture where you can sit with one pint and talk for a couple hours with somebody. But this was going on all day long, wherever you looked around the city. These kiosks would be in plazas. They would be in places of pedestrian walkways where they'd closed off streets. They'd be in parks. They'd even be up near tourist attractions. We went to one at the Castelo São Jorge at the top of Lisbon. There was one right up there. And so there's a place everywhere to stop and linger and breathe and be. We have places that maybe approximate this, but even like our coffee shops, a lot of times here you go into a coffee shop, and even in good ones, you'll see a lot of people sitting alone together. And what I noticed in the kiosk was if people were sitting alone, they really were alone together. They'd be chatting with the people at the table next to them or people walking by. It was really un-American in an awesome way. Because the thing about the kiosks, I realized, is they function as third places. A third place is a term coined by Ray Oldenburg, a sociologist, in a 1993 study he did called The Great Good Place. And he discusses the importance of these types of places, places that are not the first place, the place where you live, where you sleep, where you keep your stuff, or the second place, the place where you go do commerce or are employed, whether it's a location or a building or whatever. But the place beyond that, the third place, where you spend time, where you socialize, where you gather with others, where you tend to just be, not do, where you relax, where you engage in an uncoordinated personal experience of being and building community. Third places encourage social connection. And in our culture, some of the types of places that can function as third places are things like public parks. But our public parks don't have kiosks. Cafes, libraries now function, I think, as third places in a lot of places in America. Community centers, and even places sometimes like churches and congregations and synagogues and mosques and temples. Since Ray Oldenburg coined the term third places, another aspect about them has risen to the surface, is that they not be a silo. That if somewhere that might be a third place is only made up of people who are all the same attitudes, same demographics, it's not really a third place because you're not there with others. You're just there with another version of yourself in a group. And the thing you noticed about the kiosk is that everyone went, rich, homeless, everyone in between, locals, tourists, and everyone really was equalized. Even if it was for the 20 minutes you were at the kiosk, it was just a bunch of people hanging out together who might have no other connection with each other in any way. And you realized while you were there that everyone else got this too. It was just part of the energy of these places. And it made me realize once again that we are not a siesta culture. We don't like to stop. We don't have that tradition of stopping in the middle of every day. Lunch in Portugal, depending on where you are and what the local culture is, lasts anywhere between 12 and 2 and 12 and 4. We can't get away with that here. Our culture doesn't invite it. Climate-wise, we don't, in most of the country, get hot enough to kind of need the break from being out there. But our culture and the way we've set up to always be producing and doing and making and functioning almost repels that siesta culture, something we could really work on fixing. Kiosk culture is slow. It emphasizes the slow living movement, connection, reflection. And from these comes gratitude. It really does change your attitude. It helps you go with Pancake and sit under the picnic table and just look at the park and be perfectly satisfied with that. Doesn't matter if Tony has to go to church in another half hour and get something done. We're sitting right here. We know the neurobiology of gratitude is that it stimulates the rest and digest response as opposed to the fight or flight response. So that practice of gratitude in a place that's kind of designed, built on purpose for you to rest and digest is great for emphasizing the importance, the recognition of giving thanks just for being there. Now, you may be thinking, all of this is great, Reverend Tony, but we have to live in the real world. Well, that's the whole point I think I'm trying to make, is that we've been brainwashed into thinking the real world is the world of individualism and business and profit and accomplishing things and consuming and always making and always doing and always functioning and always being part of the economic wheel. And it's not. Kiosks and that culture they inspire, that attitude of gratitude says, step out of the matrix. It's not lazy. It's not irresponsible. In fact, it's in a sense revolutionary. You tell the world of economic exploitation at all levels to take a hike when you sit at a kiosk. We've been programmed to always be making and doing and producing and achieving, so much so that we equate human value with production and how much money we make and what job we have. Quantity. The kiosk culture says to all that, we want quality. Kiosk culture, gratitude culture, is an act of resistance against a political and economic and cultural system based on a hierarchy of wealth and power. And the view that the individual, not as a human being, not as a citizen, but a commodity, a depersonalized consumer of goods and services. And there's no inherent human dignity and worth in that system. In his book, Sabbath as Resistance, Columbia Theological Professor Emeritus Walter Brueggemann says that rest on the Sabbath is an act of revolution and resistance against the economics of exploitation, which is basically what our practice of capitalism in our culture has become. Sitting in kiosks, I thought a lot about my dog and a lot about Sabbath, which is one of my most favorite religious ideas from any tradition in the world. A day of rest. And not just of rest, but of savoring life, of being alive, of thanks to God, of thanks for what you have, of thanks for being there. Kiosk culture is a Sabbath culture, a culture that even here on the Sabbath, which is not really the Sabbath, but you know what I mean, we've kind of lost. In the Talmud, a collection of Jewish wisdom and commentary from the early centuries of the Common Era, the Sabbath is described as, and I love this, somewhat like eternity. Isn't that the greatest? That rest, that attitude of gratitude, that stop, that's somewhat like eternity. It's forever in a moment. Sitting under the umbrella of our table at the kiosk next to the Roman ruins in Evora, I remembered from reading Abraham Joshua Heschel that when the Romans first encountered the Jewish people, they thought they were nuts, absolutely out of their mind, bonkers, unstable, unwell, and ridiculous because of this Sabbath thing that they did. Because in Roman culture, they believed you achieved immortality by accomplishing great deeds and doing great things that people would tell after you died. And if you took a day off every 7 days, that's 1 out of 7 days you're not accomplishing stuff. Boy, that sounds familiar. But the Jewish people who developed that practice of Sabbath, they understood intrinsically that kind of immortality, that can't be bought. You can't purchase that with deeds. That kind of immortality was lived in a moment that was somewhat like eternity. Forever in the right now. And that's why Sabbath was so important. Abraham Joshua Heschel writes in his book, The Sabbath, that the Sabbath is about conquering time. The danger begins when in gaining power in the realm of space, we forfeit aspiration in the realm of time. He says the realm of time is where the goal is not to have, but to be, not to own, but to give, not to control, but to share, not to subdue, but to be in accord. Life goes wrong, he says, when the control of space, the acquisition of things becomes our concern, instead of the spending well of our time. He says to enter the holiness, the sacredness of the practice of Sabbath, you have to put down commerce, unchain yourself from toil, turn off the noise of our dissonant days and the anxiety of acquisitiveness. And he says, and I love this term from him, you have to turn away from the betrayal of embezzling from your own life. Isn't that great? What the Sabbath does is it makes you turn away from embezzling the value of your own life. Because your life is valuable in and of itself. You don't need to have a job and work 30 hours a week to justify getting SNAP benefits. You're worthy of that as a human being. Maybe our divorce from Sabbath and rest and Kiosk and gratitude is that we still hold people's value to be connected to things that has nothing to do with their value. Heschel says we must understand the world was created without our help, and it will go on just fine without us. When we take time out from the crush of business that's our usual existence and let ourselves be present, wholly right here, there in front of people, present to ourselves, to family, to friends, to the sacred, and truly engage in meaningfulness beyond consumerism and the valueness of things, we step into the immensity and totality of eternity. It's not somewhat like eternity, it is eternity in the here and now, for a moment, a forever in an instant. When we open our hearts, grateful for the vision and perspective sitting in eternity gives us, it fosters that attitude of gratitude for just being right here, right now. Sabbath culture and kiosk culture and gratitude culture cultivate a thankfulness. And if we're kept busy all the time with little time for gratitude and little time for generosity, we create a culture that is shut off, divided, antagonistic, guarded, and at each other's throats. We must sit at the kiosk or under the picnic table, whatever works for you, and give thanks for the sunshine, the cafe, the vino verde, the limonada, the pastry, your companions, your family, your friends. Make the moment forever and be grateful for it. For it really is somewhat like eternity. It's like sitting in a kiosk on a Sunday afternoon. Check out my website and blog at tonylorenzen.com for even more resources that will open your mind, touch your heart, and inspire your spirit.